It was supposed to be a normal trip, like so many others I'd taken before. I was driving on an empty highway late at night, heading home after visiting some friends. The radio played softly, and the road seemed endless. That's when I saw them. A pair of men walking along the shoulder, waving their arms and signaling for help. I don't know what went through my head at that moment. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I just thought it was the right thing to do. But I pulled over. They looked worn out, and one of them said their car had broken down a little farther ahead. I hesitated for a second, but eventually, I let them into the back seat. One of them even thanked me, calling me a good-hearted guy. First, everything seemed fine. I thought I was just helping out a couple of people in need. But only a few minutes into the drive, the atmosphere shifted completely. One of the men started reaching toward his waistband, and before I could react, he pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at my head. "Pull over. Now," he said with an eerie calmness. My body froze. The other man searched my pockets, taking my wallet, phone, and even a cheap watch I was wearing. They were coordinated like they'd done this many times before. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. All I could think about was how badly this could end. When I pulled over to the side of the road, my mind was racing. The man with the gun kept it trained on me while the other rifled through the glove compartment, rummaging through everything. They didn't seem nervous, which somehow made the situation even more terrifying. "Get out of the car," one of them ordered, but just as I was reaching for the door handle, he added, "Wait. No, stay where you are. We haven't decided what to do with you yet." Those words chilled me to the core. The idea that they were debating my fate was the most terrifying moment of my life. I stayed completely still, trying to control my breathing, knowing that any wrong move could cost me everything. They argued for what felt like an eternity, as if I weren't sitting there listening to every word. One suggested leaving me on the side of the road, while the other talked about taking me farther away to leave no trace. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching them exchange looks and gestures like seasoned accomplices. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like they could hear it. I tried to mumble something, offering for them to take everything and let me go. But the man with the gun barked, "Shut up." After that, I gave up trying to plead. I sat in silence, waiting for whatever was coming next. Finally, they made a decision. The man with the gun looked at me and said, "Get out of the car." This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door slowly and stepped out, hands raised. One of them grabbed my arm and shoved me toward the side of the road, while the other slid into the driver's seat. I stood there, frozen, watching as they sped off in my car like it was theirs. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, and when everything went silent again, the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. I was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, without a phone, money, or any way to call for help, and I was terrified they might come back. The only thing I could do was walk. I didn't know where I was going, but I started down the road, hoping to find some sign of civilization. The night was cold, and the darkness around me was oppressive. Every sound, the wind, animals rustling in the bushes, made my heart leap. After walking for what felt like an hour, I finally saw lights in the distance. It was a small town with a few houses and a gas station that was still open. I ran inside and explained what had happened to the attendant, who immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, recounting the story out loud felt surreal. It was like I was talking about something that had happened to someone else, not me. The police asked me a series of questions right there at the gas station. What the men looked like, what they took, where they might have gone. I tried to remember as many details as I could, but my mind was still reeling. The most unsettling part was realizing I'd never imagined something like this could happen to me. After gathering the information, one of the officers offered to take me to the station to file a formal report. I agreed, though I was completely drained, both physically and mentally. The thought of walking home or depending on a stranger again terrified me. At the station, I called a friend who came to pick me up in the middle of the night. Sitting there in that cold, brightly lit room, I couldn't stop replaying what had happened. It was so easy to fall into their trap. They looked like two regular guys in need of help, and I trusted them without a second thought. Now, with my car stolen, my phone gone, and all my belongings taken, it felt like a harsh and bitter lesson. Deep down, I knew it could have ended much worse, and I clung to that thought to stay grounded. When I finally got home, still trembling, I made a promise to myself. Never again, under any circumstances, would I stop for someone on the side of the road. It's a decision that weighs on me because I want to help people, but after that night, I just can't take the risk anymore. It all started as an ordinary trip. I was driving down a highway, heading home after visiting friends in the countryside. The day was beautiful, the sun was shining, and I had some music playing while I drove. But things started to go wrong when my GPS suddenly stopped working. The signal completely disappeared, and I had no idea where I was. I decided to keep going straight, thinking I'd eventually see a sign or a landmark. But all I saw was the road narrowing and becoming more isolated. Before I knew it, I was driving on a dirt path in the middle of a dense forest, with tall trees on both sides and no sign of life anywhere. That's when I hit a pothole too big to avoid. The car jolted, and I immediately felt the thud of a flat tire. I pulled over and got out to check. There it was, completely wrecked. My heart started racing. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, with no GPS signal and surrounded by a forest I knew was home to wildlife. With every step I took, it felt like I could hear noises coming from the woods, distant growls, branches snapping, and unidentifiable sounds. My mind started to race, imagining snakes, jaguars, or whatever else might be watching me, waiting to strike. I knew I needed to change the tire, but every second out there felt like an eternity. The silence of the forest was broken by sporadic noises, a distant growl, the rustling of leaves, like something was getting closer. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I grabbed the jack and the spare tire from the trunk, but my hands were shaking so badly that I struggled to put the pieces together. Every move I made felt like I was a sitting duck, exposed to whatever might be lurking in the shadows. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. A snake slithering out of the bushes or a larger animal appearing out of nowhere. The heat and my nerves had me sweating so much that my face felt constantly damp. After what felt like an eternity, I finally managed to change the tire. I jumped back into the car as quickly as I could and sped off without even glancing back. But now there was a new problem: how to get out of there. Without GPS and no signs pointing me in any direction, I was completely disoriented. I kept driving down the narrow path, trying to stay calm, but the fear clung to me like a shadow. After a few minutes that felt like hours, I saw a light in the distance. It was the highway again. The relief was indescribable. Once I was back on the asphalt, I took a deep breath and continued driving slowly, still unsure of where I was going but grateful to be away from that forest. Back on the highway, I felt a bit calmer, but I was still lost. Every mile I drove, the landscape seemed more desolate. Then, in the distance, I spotted a small makeshift stand on the side of the road. It looked like a fruit stall, with produce hanging from ropes and an elderly man sitting on a stool. I decided to stop. Maybe he could help me figure out where I was. I pulled over and got out, trying to appear less nervous than I actually was. The man looked at me curiously, as if he was used to seeing lost travelers. Before I could even say anything, he said, "You got yourself lost, didn't you?" I explained what had happened and asked how to get to the nearest town. He gave me a kind smile and calmly explained the directions, pointing me in the right direction. His instructions were simple, and I finally felt like I was on the path back to civilization. I thanked him and bought some fruit as a small gesture of gratitude, even though I didn't really need it. As I walked back to my car, he called out, "Be careful next time. That forest isn't for just anyone." I couldn't tell if he was trying to scare me or being serious, but those words echoed in my head as I drove away. It wasn't until I reached a gas station in the next town that I truly felt safe. Even then, I was still shaking from the memory of feeling watched in that forest. At the gas station, I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply. I was exhausted both physically and mentally. I parked the car, bought a bottle of water, and sat down for a few minutes to collect myself. The attendant asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded, unable to explain what I had just gone through. It was hard to put into words. The fear, the constant sense of danger, the sounds that seemed to surround me in that forest. Now, sitting amidst the noise of the city and the hum of passing cars, it all felt so distant. Yet the chills on my spine remained. Following the old man's directions was a relief, but the experience stayed with me. To this day, whenever I think about taking an unfamiliar route, I remember that night. I remember the sounds, the growls, and the overwhelming vulnerability of being completely alone in an unknown place. It was one of those moments that changes how you see the world. I learned that no matter how much you trust technology or your instincts, being prepared is essential. And most importantly, never underestimate what can happen when you find yourself in a place you don't know. I was lucky to make it out of that situation, but I wouldn't wish that kind of tension on anyone. I never thought I'd find myself in such a bizarre situation on a deserted road. It was late at night, my wife was asleep in the passenger seat, and my 3-year-old son was buckled up in the back, completely passed out. We were driving home after visiting my in-laws, who live in a remote area, and trying to make it back before dawn. I was driving slowly because the road was dark, bordered by tall grass on one side and a deep ditch on the other. Not a single soul was in sight, and the only thing visible was my car's headlights illuminating the cracked, worn asphalt. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something huge fall off the trailer ahead of us. A heavy piece of furniture that landed squarely in the middle of the road with a loud thud. I slammed on the brakes, swerved hard, and nearly ended up in the ditch. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through me. When I finally stopped the car, still shaking, I looked in the rearview mirror. My wife had woken up, startled, and my son was whimpering in confusion from the sudden jolt. I felt a mix of relief and panic realizing we hadn't gone over the edge, but the scare was intense. My wife asked what had happened, and I could only point to the massive piece of furniture blocking half the road ahead. Worse yet, the trailer that had lost it had also stopped a little farther up. I saw a man get out, flashlight in hand, walking toward us. But instead of looking concerned or apologetic, he was yelling loudly, gesturing aggressively as if the whole thing had been my fault. That's when it hit me. We were in the middle of nowhere, no cell signal, facing an angry and unpredictable man with no one to call for help. For a moment, I felt completely vulnerable. I opened the car door and stepped out with my hands up, trying to show we weren't looking for trouble. My wife stayed inside, tense, unsure whether to lock the doors or get out as well. Standing there on the edge of the road, the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the man's heavy breathing as he marched toward me. His flashlight was blinding, but I could make out his face twisted in anger. He shouted that I had been driving too close to the trailer, that my carelessness had almost caused an accident, and that he wasn't going to let me off easy. I tried explaining that the furniture had fallen right in front of me and I had no choice but to swerve, but he didn't want to hear it. It was as if the presence of my family made everything worse, and he seemed ready to explode. I didn't know what to do except try to stay calm and avoid provoking him further. The tension in the air was suffocating. From inside the car, I could see my wife gripping the steering wheel tightly, her face frozen in fear. My son, still groggy, whimpered softly, not understanding what was happening. My legs felt shaky, and I was sweating as I scanned the surroundings for any sign of help. An illuminated house, another car passing by, anything. But there was nothing. Just our headlights, the man's flashlight, and the oppressive darkness surrounding us. He stepped closer, stopping less than a foot away, shining his light directly in my face. I felt like he was testing me, waiting for me to lose my cool or make a wrong move. That's when I realized our only advantage was not playing into his anger, not escalating things, not letting this turn into a physical confrontation. But inside, I was terrified, unsure how much longer I could keep my composure. I spoke as calmly as I could, saying we didn't mean to cause any trouble and were just trying to avoid an accident. But his rage seemed uncontrollable, as if our mere presence was an offense. I started noticing details about him. The dirty leather jacket, the scruffy beard, the bloodshot eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days. He kept glancing back at the trailer as if considering grabbing something from it. My wife whispered my name from inside the car, her voice trembling, but I didn't know whether to go back or stay where I was. The anxiety churned in my stomach like a fire, the fear that he might lash out at any moment. With no cell signal and no passing cars, it felt like we were cut off from the world, trapped on this lonely stretch of asphalt. The only sounds were the wind, my son's quiet sobs, and the man's heavy breathing right in front of me. He pointed his flashlight at the fallen furniture, muttering about how much trouble it would be to move it off the road and blaming us for following too closely. I tried explaining again that we weren't tailgating, that he hadn't secured the load properly, but the more I talked, the angrier he seemed to get. He kicked the wooden piece, the hollow sound echoing in the silence. I thought about offering to help move it, hoping it might calm him down, but something told me to keep my distance. It was one of those situations where you don't know whether to keep your head down and agree with everything or turn and leave. But walking away felt risky, and staying put didn't feel safe either. The unease was overwhelming, like something terrible could happen at any second, and I knew I was completely on my own. At one point, he started circling the car slowly, his flashlight sweeping over the windows and stopping on my wife's face. She turned her head, trying to avoid his gaze, and it only made me more anxious. There was nowhere to run. The road was narrow, bordered by tall grass on one side and a ditch on the other. If I tried to get in the car and speed away, we'd probably crash into the furniture or go over the edge. The feeling of being cornered was suffocating, and my throat felt dry. My son's soft sobs behind me only made me more desperate to get us out of there. But there seemed to be no easy way. I thought about trying to talk to him again, but he seemed lost in thought, inspecting every inch of the car like a predator sizing up its prey. Then suddenly his demeanor shifted. He stepped back from the car, lowering his flashlight, and just stood there staring at me. It was like he was calculating something in his head, and I couldn't even begin to guess what. My heart was still racing, and I half expected him to grab a weapon from the trailer or block us from leaving. But instead, he raised the flashlight, looked at me for a few seconds without saying a word, and then turned around and walked back toward his trailer. The silence was so abrupt that I almost doubted what was happening. My wife stared at me through tearful eyes, equally confused. I stood frozen, watching him disappear into the darkness, climb into his vehicle, and start the engine. It was as if all that rage had suddenly evaporated. He drove off without a backward glance, and I stood there, stunned, unsure whether to say something or just take the chance to leave. The sound of his trailer fading into the distance was the only thing I could hear besides my breathing and my son's quiet sobs. When I finally gathered enough courage, I rushed back to the driver's seat, started the car, and tried to maneuver around the fallen furniture, scraping the paint and making a horrible noise as I pushed it out of the way. We finally managed to drive forward, and as I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, I expected to see him reappear, but he didn't. The road remained dark and empty, with no trace of him. With no phone signal, no witnesses, and no understanding of what had just happened, all we could do was keep driving. To this day, thinking about that night still sends chills down my spine, as if the experience is permanently etched in some corner of my mind. We continued the journey in near silence. My wife tried to calm our son, singing softly to him, while I kept my eyes fixed on the road, replaying everything that had just happened. It didn't make sense for someone to get so furious over an accident they caused, nor did it make sense for him to leave so suddenly after terrifying us. Without cell service, there was no one to call. Not the police, not anyone for help. It was just the three of us, the hum of the engine, and the heavy silence hanging in the air. I tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe he was drunk or mentally unstable or embarrassed once he realized he was wrong. But nothing erased the fear we felt in that moment, the vulnerability of being stranded in the middle of nowhere at the mercy of a stranger. Even after we reached a stretch of road with more lights and houses in the distance, the tension didn't immediately lift. It wasn't until we reached an area with cell service that I fully grasped how surreal it all was. My wife called her parents to let them know we were okay but left out the details, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. All I wanted was to get home, lock the door, and pretend none of it had happened. But it's impossible to forget. That fear, that chill down my spine, and the certainty that things could have gone very, very wrong still haunt me. Even now, whenever I drive at night on empty roads, I stay hyper-alert, scanning for any signs of danger. That man disappeared as quickly as he appeared, and to this day, I can't explain his behavior or what went through his mind. It's one of those things that doesn't make sense. A scare that stays with you forever and reminds you how fragile and alone we are in certain situations. I know I'll never forget that night. It's etched into me forever.